Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers. I'm going to read from her bio. She's a writer, director, producer, and actor. She's a member of the Kainai First Nation, Blood Tribe, Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Sami from Norway. She began her filmmaking career in 2011 with the experimental short Bloodland. Since then, she has gone on to explore narrative fiction, documentary, mockumentary, music video, and archival video remix. Her work is often community focused and rooted in social justice. Her award-winning films have screened at festivals around the world, including the Berlinale International Film Festival, the Vancouver International Film Festival, Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, the Seattle International Film Festival, and the TIFF Top 10 Festival. Her films have been broadcast on the CBC, Bravo, APTN, and the Knowledge Network. And currently she's just wrapping up work on her feature-length documentary about her community's response to the opioid crisis. So looking forward to talking with Elle-Máijá. And then we also have Kimberly Bautista. Kimberly Bautista is a Colombian-American filmmaker who sees films as a pathway towards liberation, harmony with the land, and taxing the rich. Her feature-length documentary, Justice for My Sister, about one Guatemalan woman's determination to hold her sister's killer accountable, has been part of a transnational feminist campaign to break the silence with UN Women. She founded the nonprofit Justice for My Sister Collective to train women of color, non-binary youth, and former foster youth in filmmaking with a gender equality and racial justice lens. She's directed short documentaries, music videos, and a pilot dramedy. She's currently in post-production with a dramatic short with supernatural elements about intergenerational healing. And this conversation is being hosted by Justice for My Sister. Justice for My Sister is a collective. Justice for My Sister Collective is a nonprofit organization that trains women of color, non-binary artists, and foster youth to make films with a gender equity and racial justice lens as a means to heal from trauma and overcome financial barriers to entering the TV and film industry. And the co-host for this conversation is Free the Work. Free the Work is a curated talent discovery platform for underrepresented creators. So I'm really excited that we are going to have this conversation today. Since we're talking about trauma-informed filmmaking, I think it's important for us to share the space with intention. And so what that means, I think we all can enter community spaces and create community guidelines that make the most sense for everyone. I think in this setting, it's important for us to be present, to take care of ourselves, to make space so that we don't monopolize conversations and allow voices that are usually not heard to be heard. When we're sharing information with each other in the chat or in questions, we try to make sure that we prepare the audience for what we're about to talk about. It's commonly known as a trigger warning. If you feel like it's necessary, I think it's important to take that into consideration given the conversation that we're going to have today. Always speak from the I as much as possible. I think those are good community guidelines. And I think, you know, having a conversation, it's always good to come from a place of openness and inquiry and question, as opposed to coming from a place of thinking we know and we're closed and we're not ready to hear and investigate with each other. So I feel like those are good community guidelines for us today. And then I think we're ready to get started, but I heard Kimberly this when we were talking before the event, and she suggested that we brief together, and I think that it's a really good thing for us to do. So I want you to take a moment and take a deep breath in, and then release. Plant yourself, root yourself where you are, and take another deep breath in. And release. And then finally, with a beautiful intention of us holding space with each other and having a good conversation and inspiring each other and supporting each other, let's take one final community breath together. So in and release. Thank you so much for doing that with all of us. So in order to get started, I think the best thing or the best way for us to get started is to make sure we all know and get grounded and understand what we mean by trauma informed. So let's take a look at some slides and hear Kimberly explain to us what we mean when we say trauma informed.
Thank you, Janet. I really appreciate you facilitating this conversation today. It means a lot. So thank you for being here and holding space. I also want to just thank Julissa Villatoro for being here as support, technical support. Julie is one of our graduates from Justice for My Sisters programs, and she's also kind of come up in the ranks as a mentor and coordinator. So it's really wonderful to be able to be here in community with each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. So essentially, when we talk about trauma-informed storytelling, we're talking about theory in action or a praxis. And on behalf of Justice for My Sister, what we're trying to do with this initiative is to encourage writers, directors, and producers to make films that are healing centered. So films that both honor experiences of trauma and lend space for imagining what liberation and healing look like. Next slide, please. And trauma-informed stories essentially are stories that acknowledge both personal and collective trauma to reclaim the narrative from a lens of liberation. And I want to name that so much of the ideation of this initiative has just developed over the years. We do a lot of education, media arts education, as Janet was describing in the introduction. And so our director of education, Hilda Franco, has developed some curriculum around how to actually be trauma informed in the way that we administer our classes as educators. And so then from that, from that knowledge base, we were able to kind of develop these guidelines on what is the actual outcome of these stories and how do they land. Next slide, please. So these stories are made also, we're looking at the way that we're actually producing these stories. We're creating safe space, both in the writing process and in the production process. So this is marked by transparency, trust, mutual collaboration, so that healing is possible through this creation process. And really, the work that we do at Justice for My Sister is to train folks to tell their stories in a way that creates a space for healing. So in reclaiming our stories, in breaking the silence, in being the authors of our own narratives, we were able to essentially embark on this healing process through the art of creation. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed stories also are made by creators who are critically asking questions and engaging with their own work. So we're looking at ways that we can address power dynamics. When we're telling a story, you know, we inherently enter into a position of power because we are molding and shaping a narrative. So how can we be accountable to our communities, to our families, to our loved ones who are inspiring these stories in a way that's transparent and that's ethical as well. Trauma-informed stories also reimagine a narrative that defies the conflict-based model. So this, I think, is so crucial because we're so indoctrinated from Hollywood on how conflict is what shapes a character, right? Conflict is what shapes a journey. And so, you know, oftentimes we become so connected to this idea of drama as being a means to essentially create a narrative and move forward a journey. And so we're trying to actually reclaim various ways of reshaping that narrative, reimagining a narrative that's actually based on meaning, on experience, on truth. And so we're really looking towards the ways that that our ancestors have told stories, right? That we're able to really reclaim that and reimagine that for ourselves moving forward. And I know so many people are doing really important work around this. And in our Black, Indigenous, people of color sci-fi screenwriting lab, we talked a lot about how can we actually reclaim Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of telling stories to disrupt this conflict-based model and to really center our experiences as a way to develop knowledge and understand that that's a technology, right? That's a tool. Next slide, please. Justice for My Sister has repurposed best practices from treatment-based models. So both trauma-informed care and healing-centered modalities to create a community education praxis. So with this, with our sort of reimagining and reshaping of these best practices, we were able to create the trauma-informed facilitation guidelines for media arts educators, which is what we use as kind of the base for all of our programs when we're teaching folks how to make movies. Also, guiding principles on suggestions of how to run sets and productions as at when we are in that creator role, right? So how can we leverage our influence in our own sets and our own productions to create a healing-centered experience where everybody can collaborate and where people feel safe and heard and seen. Also, we've created strategies and questions that as creators, we can reflect on that look at the actual impact of our stories. So do I actually have consent to tell this story, right? Is it affirmative consent from the community that either I'm documenting or even from my family, right? Like basically we've created a series of questions to investigate that and so that we can be self-reflective in the creation process. Also to look at the impact that we have on the audiences, because sometimes we have a certain intention with our message, but what is the actual impact, right? And also some of the other questions that we have are like, is the violence necessary? Is representation of violence necessary to actually move the story forward, right? Is there other creative ways that you can convey any sort of violence that might be a plot point that's not graphic, right? So I think that this is why we're so fortunate to have Elle-Máijá here this evening to share the way that she was able to engage with those questions. Next slide, please. So really, the importance of doing this work is that we recognize the impact that the white supremacist capitalist cis heteropatriarchy has on replicating itself, right? It has this potential to replicate itself through storytelling in all mediums and thereby normalize violence of all forms, but also the subjugation of women, gender nonconforming folks, LGBTQIA folks, people with disabilities, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So because of these trends, we are creating sort of this tool and these conversations on how we can center voices of communities who have been historically excluded from the mainstream. And centering these voices is crucial for us to create a vision of liberation. So as storytellers, as visionaries, as artists, as purveyors of culture, it's important that we see it as a responsibility, that we acknowledge it as sacred work, that we acknowledge it as an honor to be able to reimagine, produce and elevate images and stories that preserve peace, joy, and well-being in the collective consciousness, right? also, this conversation is an opportunity for everybody in attendance to recommit. I think it's a constant process of recommitting to creating stories of the world that we want to see, imagining ourselves as queer folks, as people of color who are living in the future in powerful ways. And so this, in particular, this sentiment was really what informed so much of the Black Indigenous People of Color Sci-Fi Screenwriting Lab that we hosted at the beginning of quarantine. And we were so fortunate to have Janet as one of our facilitators, one of our mentors. We had just an incredible lineup of professionals that were there to help us really capture this. And I think that this also speaks to the radical imagination and how that is so crucial for liberation, right? And at the end of the day, it's like we have enough movies about the end of the world, right? We need to see films about the end of capitalism and the beginning of something new. So it's important, and I'm happy that we're here to really talk about what it is that we're against, right? And then also, this is an opportunity for us to sit again and reimagine what is it that we stand for. What is it that how does liberation look and feel like? And these are also questions that our sisters at Affirm have been asking for many years. So we're pulling on so many incredible activists, transnational feminists, authors, right? And so we're really standing on the legacy of so many teachers, and we're just really honored to be able to engage in this conversation and learn from all of you as well. And again, I just want to thank Maya so much for your work, and it's just so inspiring to see filmmakers doing the work and creating work that is trauma informed. So thank you so much.
Now that we've been grounded in the definition, and I think that there was so much in that definition that I was paying attention to. One is work that is centered on healing. Another part that was really important to me is about storytelling that honors the way that our ancestors told stories and what they told stories for, which was and is always for healing. And making sure that there are ways of presenting the impact of violence without re-traumatizing people, right, by the depiction. So there's a lot in there. And in order to continue laying the groundwork for the conversation, I think it would be also great to take a look at the trailer of the film, The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, by our guest, Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers, because it is an example of some of this work, as well as her current work that she's working on that we will talk about. So let's take a look at the trailer now.
I don't want to be like one of those girls, the baby. Do you know I love you so, and mommy will never let go. You got anybody looking out for you, Rosie? Rosie! I look out for myself. Do you know I love you so? He doesn't even mean it most likely. And mommy will not trying to tell you what to do. Never let you go. Then what are you trying to do? To the stars. I'm just trying to help. In the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey oh, hey oh, hey oh.
So I'm sorry. Elle-Máijá, thank you so much for this film. It really touched me when I saw it. It's such a blessing because it is definitely embodying some of the things that Kimberly was talking about in her definition of what trauma-informed storytelling can be. But can you talk to us a little bit about your process in terms of making this film, creating this film, producing this film? How did you incorporate ways of protecting both yourself as a storyteller, the people who are embodying the film as the actors, and the audience that eventually was going to receive this blessing of a film? Can you talk to us about your process and how
Sure.
it? Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for all your kind words, and yeah, it's an honor to be here. Um, so the film it's inspired by an event that happened in real life in the same neighborhood that we shot the film, my neighborhood. I would say it's probably been at least 5 years now. Much like in the film, I encountered a young Indigenous woman had just fled, who just fled her home where her partner had assaulted her, and she was very pregnant and standing at a very busy intersection on like a cold February day here in Vancouver. And nobody was stopping for her. And I ended up taking her home with me. She didn't want to go to the police, she didn't want to go to the hospital. And so I took her home with me. And that resulted in us spending the next few hours together and me sort of thinking that I could help solve her problems simply because I was, in a more maybe stable situation. Um, but it was such an incredible confrontation of my own privilege. I'm Indigenous. I'm as you said, Blackfoot from Kainai. I'm also Sami from Norway. But I think as an Indigenous person, well, I think in general privilege can be relative. And as an Indigenous person, I was raised by both of my parents. I've never experienced the child welfare system. I didn't experience or witness domestic violence really growing up. And so for me, those are points of privilege, as well as the fact that I benefit from light skin privilege. I am university educated and I'm basically comfortably middle class right now. And all of that is so different from the lived experience of someone like Rosie in the film. And so that experience that I had in real life was a confrontation of all of that privilege, and um, it really opened my eyes to how naive I was as well about the experiences of women who are living with intimate partner violence and sort of the lack of resources that are available for them, or just how overburdened the support systems are when it comes to these situations. And so I carried that experience with me for years, not really knowing what to do with it. I actually still go past her building almost on a daily basis because it's so close to home. I've never seen her since that day, and I've tried to find her on social media and haven't been able to find her. So I really have no idea where she is and how she's doing. And initially, I thought, like, if I were to turn this into a film, I need her blessing, but that's just not possible in the sense I can't find her. I don't even know if she gave me her real name, but I wanted to be able to honor our shared experience and be able to share the same sort of complicated questions that emerge from encounters like this. And I hadn't seen that many stories of urban Indigenous women on the screen before. And this was an opportunity to explore the intersections of class and race and all of that within the lived experiences of two very different Indigenous women. And so there was a lot to unpack ethically. The first was, do I have the right to tell this story, given that I can't even get this person's consent? And so ultimately, I decided to proceed and to fictionalize the character Rosie. She's a completely new character. My co-writer and co-director, Kathleen Hepburn, who's incredibly talented, she and I decided to fictionalize the story as well and make it our own, but maintain the core concept of these two Indigenous women encountering each other after a domestic violence situation. And so, yeah, the core elements of the story remained. But then in terms of our process, I really appreciated Kimberly's presentation, especially in regards to the issue of like a constant sort of like self-interrogation or questioning of one's position, the way that we hold power as storytellers, and the ways that we navigate through all of that. And so Kathleen and I, we both benefit from all sorts of different forms of privilege. And I think as filmmakers, we're always in a position of power. And so for us, it was really important to make sure that we weren't replicating extractive forms of filmmaking, wherein we were just taking a story from a community whose lived experience neither of us had. And so one of the first things we did was hold like a script writing workshop with a group of young Indigenous women who had been through the child welfare system. And we offered like a free workshop to them and actually paid them for their time. And then we did a table read and workshopped our script. And they offered so much rich feedback. And that was kind of like our first opportunity to engage with community at a very early stage. Like this was probably our second or third draft of the script. It was really important for us to not get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of developing the story before actually consulting and working with the community whose story we were telling. And in this sense, I think it's important to think about community as like an expansive thing, and it can mean so many different things beyond just where you're from geographically. But I think, community can encompass so many different things. And so that was the first step. And then moving forward, we had to think about everything from like cast and crew, and how do we make this film in a way that also doesn't replicate the toxic hierarchy of storytelling that exists within the film industry. And we also, wanted to, I guess, just ensure that every step of the way we were doing this in the best way possible. And I really appreciated what Kim said about like a healing-centric focus rather than a trauma-centric focus. As an Indigenous person, I think our stories are so often more digestible, I guess, to settler audiences when our trauma is like fully on display. And there's this kind of like insatiable desire to consume Indigenous trauma, and I think the same exists for all stories of BIPOC people on screen when it comes to the types of films that settlers are maybe most comfortable watching. And so that was something that is something I consider in all of my work, how not to satiate that settler desire to witness our trauma on screen, how to first and foremost make this for my community or communities, and how to take care of my audience and recognize that there's a relationship there with my audience, regardless of whether or not I ever meet these people. We do form a relationship in that engagement with the story. And so that was something Kathleen and I thought a lot about. And then we also thought about, the issue of violence on screen, and how do we depict that, especially as women who haven't experienced intimate partner violence. And it was very obvious from the get-go that we didn't need to depict any violence on screen, because we were making this film for women, especially Indigenous women and youth who'd been through the foster care system here in Canada. And so the depiction of violence was just so unnecessary and something we were completely uninterested in, because the story is really about what happens after the violence, and what happens between these two women and the relationship that's built between them in that very short period of time. So immediately, you know, we decided no violence. We don't even really need to see the male characters on screen at all because they don't serve the story really in any way. Um, and then when we moved forward with crewing our film, we realized very quickly that we wouldn't be able to hire as many Indigenous technicians as we'd hoped, simply because there's not enough of us in the industry, people who are working, you know, in the key departments in terms of like sound and editing and lighting, all of those things. There's a ton of really talented Indigenous writers and directors and producers, but not enough technicians. And so we decided to help build capacity within the industry and created this Indigenous Youth Mentorship project, which was a paid mentorship. And we hired 11 Indigenous youth in all the key departments to work in a collaborative way directly with the head of each department. And for us, it wasn't simply about like teaching them and giving them a, you know, an opportunity to learn. It was also a way for us to like have a relationship with Indigenous youth who have potentially experiences very similar to what's happening in the film. It was a way to ground us in the work and kind of like create a sense of like mutual responsibility. And so that was a really incredible experience, just having these young people be part of the process. And so that kind of led us to this next barrier, which is that a lot of the people who are working on our crew were settlers. Many of them were white settlers. I've been working on a documentary for the last 4.5 years in my own community and have brought in a number of non-Indigenous settlers on the crew to my community and had some troubling experiences. And that's what kind of led me to do like mandatory cultural competency training and Indigenous history training for this crew. And so we decided to implement the same idea to The Body Remembers. So we had a session with our full crew that was mandatory, where a really talented young Indigenous lawyer came in and she did a presentation all about the history of colonialism in Canada, the resilience and strength that exists within the many Indigenous nations that are still around. And yeah, she just gave a really incredible presentation, and I think it helped ground the entire crew sort of in this understanding that like this is a very real story. It's unfolding around us every day, and that we're not making this film for entertainment purposes. You know, it's a story that hopefully has healing potential. And so those were things that we'd considered all along the way. And something else that I guess when it comes to thinking about trauma-informed storytelling, we ended up casting Violet Nelson as our lead actor, and she's such a phenomenally talented young woman, and she'd never acted before. And we found her through an open casting call, and we came to understand that Violet had had lived experiences similar to that of Rosie. And she talks about it quite publicly. Her mother experienced an abusive relationship, and Violet also lived briefly in foster homes. And so Kathleen and I realized very quickly that yes, it's you know, a performance advantage to be working with someone who understands that lived experience so deeply, but it's also a huge responsibility for us as the writers and directors to take care of this young person. I mean, Violet was only 17 when we shot the film, and it was her first acting experience. And so it was really important for us to make sure that we were taking care of her throughout the process. And so what we did was we did a number of things. Kathleen and I went and saw a therapist who works in trauma-informed care. And this therapist gave us a whole bunch of really useful tools in terms of how to work with trauma, how to work with someone who has experienced trauma in a way that that allows us to move forward in strength. And so, yeah, we ended up implementing those tools all throughout the rehearsal process. And we ended up rehearsing actually for 4 weeks before we went to camera. So we treated the film like a play. And so when we did shoot it, it was like one continuous take that we did once a day for 5 days. And so the rehearsal process was like a really beautiful, intimate experience where it was like Violet, myself, Kathleen, and our directing mentee, Jade Baxter. We all just, we're in this space together, and Kathleen and I did our best to, yeah, just make sure that we were consistently checking in with Violet every day. She had journaling time at the end of the day, every day. We had these tools in place that we would utilize and kind of always try and be aware of how she was feeling and checking in with her. And we decided it was also important to ground ourselves in culture, and to ground Violet in the support that culture can offer. And so we hired an elder from her community who she was actually related to come and take care of her, basically, for her to debrief with, for her to talk to at the end of every performance, because again, we did it once a day for 5 days, and it was like so exhausting and also really thrilling. But it was so important for us to have, that emotional support that's like grounded and rooted in culture, specifically for Violet. So there were so many things that we considered along the way. And again, all of these sort of alternative tactics that we had, I think resulted from, over a decade of being in the industry and seeing all of the messed up ways that the industry functions. And so, we were trying to not do that. And so this was kind of like an active, I guess, like subversion or resistance to the industry that we're so used to operating within.
Thank you so much. There was so much there that you shared about the process. And I would like Kimberly to respond, especially around the ideas of consent, of permission to tell, who tells whose story, of collaboration, of making sure that the storytelling is not extractive, the production is not extractive, including the Native young people as mentees in an industry that didn't create opportunities for them to participate in the first place. And taking time. I heard a lot about taking time and thought in every part of the process, which is so opposite to what the industry usually pushes, which is get it done, produce. So I'd love to hear Kimberly talk about in response to what you heard about the process that went into this film.
Yeah, again, Maya, I'm just so moved by your work and all of the thought and intention that you put into this production, because I think you were just so coherent and consistent with the intention of the film. I mean, the intention of the film is it's to create healing, right? To kind of also reclaim and re-engage with this experience that deeply affected you and was so riveting, but at the same time, like disruptive. And so the fact that you did so much work consulting and bringing on both a therapist and an elder to provide that support to your lead actress. I mean, that is just so beautiful and so thoughtful. And I just want to name that I really appreciate that, and I think that is completely just an example of trauma-informed storytelling in the process, in the production. And it really does also show in the outcome of the film as well, just in terms of like the different decisions that you made of like you mentioned, the partner not being on screen. And that was just such a for me, that's a very definitive marker of trauma-informed storytelling, is like, how can we convey what we need to convey about the trauma without making the film about it, or without subjecting the audience to becoming triggered or re-traumatized through the telling of the story. And I think that's why trauma-informed approaches are so important, because, you know, oftentimes survivors are subjected in the very systems that are supposed to grant us justice. We're very oftentimes subjected to re-traumatization because we have to recount our stories, we have to relive our experiences in this way that does feel very extractive. And so the fact that you were able to kind of reformulate that experience with camera perspective and even perspective of the characters, right? The fact that when Rosie is listening to, she puts on the headphones and she's listening to the Joni Mitchell song, and, you know, in the background, Ayla is conversing and trying to, you know, do the work of kind of, and I think it is so beautiful, like how you kind of named your own experience too, of this dynamic of wanting to help, but then, and we see it unfold in the film, how Rosie's not ready to receive that kind of support, right? And so grappling with these questions, I think it's just so important, because we actually see other characters from the safe house giving that context, right? And kind of dispelling this almost like this preconceived notion from Ayla that has to be this way, right? And so I think that that's a really beautiful way to weave in that trauma-informed approach, by having these other characters that are able to really ground the narrative and a different perspective. And through that, we're able to kind of understand the positionality of these different characters as well. But just the fact, going back to that moment where Rosie is listening on the headphones to the song, it's like she's drowning out Ayla's search and all the phone calls, right? So we enter into her perspective. And I'm really curious to know what went into that process of deciding, you know, at what point you enter into whose perspective. And I also, you know, want to name, like, it's just so admirable and wonderful that you were able to bring on young people to get that on-set training. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to, like, learning more about, you know, how their career trajectories evolve. Because yeah, we need more people of color in the industry, you know, in Canada as well as here in the United States. So yeah, I think it's just really great work. And yeah, I'm curious to know about that perspective shift.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it was really important for us for Kathleen and I, to not, I don't know, like, replicate a savior narrative, because that's not what happened at all. It was an encounter between myself and this young woman, who ended up teaching me so much, and it became so apparent that she was, you know, powerful in her own right and had so many more tools to deal with the situation than I did. And it was important for us to kind of show that through this story, just to maintain a power balance between Ayla and Rosie, and to ensure that Rosie's character always had agency and power and choice. And it was important to be able to share this story from both women's perspectives. And so that was like a thing we consistently navigated with every scene that we wrote, like, who has the power here? Why is it important for this person to have power? And in what ways does that power relationship consistently shift throughout the story? And so some of that was decided, most of it was decided in the script, but some was also decided in the rehearsal process. We spent, you know, again, 4 weeks together working through the entire thing. And, you know, there's really incredible things that can emerge from having an extensive rehearsal process like that. It's the opportunity to build trust and a relationship and like a deeper understanding of each other and the text. And we also work through a lot of that with our really talented cinematographer, 𝘞𝘰𝘤𝘺. So yeah, it was considered at every stage of the process, and it was so important for us to always ensure that Violet's character, Rosie, had agency and power, and that despite this being such a heavy story, that audiences would walk away with the understanding that there's so many young people like Rosie who are so resourceful and resilient and capable. They just, you know, have the weight of the world on their shoulders, and it's so important to not frame those people as victims, and that was, yeah, what we hoped audiences would walk away with, is that, you know, Rosie is so much more than a victim. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely responded. There were two scenes that I felt very strongly that are in line with what you're talking about. One is when Rosie is in the taxi and they're going to the safe house, and she starts telling the taxi driver um, that Ayla is the one who's actually finally decided to go to rehab. And there's such a the acting is so beautiful because there's such a mischievous glint in her eye, because you know she is taking power back at that moment, you know, and shaping the narrative in a different way, and making the taxi driver think that Ayla is the one who's being dropped off, and that you know it's not the other way around. And I loved it, and it was such a light moment too, but it had a lot of significance. I noticed that. And then obviously to me it's really beautiful, the perspective shifting that you do throughout the film. And one of those other moments is when Rosie goes in to the bathroom to sing to her child. And then I love that the song that is used in that moment is what you hear at the end. And just her blessing for her child. That's what I left the film thinking about, is that she has a blessing for her child, that she has the agency and the power to say, I have a vision for my child. I know what I want my child to be able to do and be in the world, and to be safe in this world, regardless of what I'm going through at the moment. I do have a vision for my child. And I think that was very powerful. So I just wanted to mention those moments as well. I wanted to ask you what the reception has been of the film, and do you see the way that all the work that you put into, you know, center healing, to not re-traumatize people, both in the making of and also in what is on the film, has that had an impact on audiences? What have the conversations been like when people have received the film?
Thank you for all of that. Those are two of my favorite scenes too. It was a lot of fun to write the taxi cab scene. It was really important for us to show Rosie as, you know, a multi-dimensional human being with a sense of humor. And Violet in real life is just this like really funny person. Every day on set, she was pulling practical jokes with like the whole crew. So it was, yeah, important for us to show Rosie as like a multi-dimensional human being who still has the capacity to laugh despite everything she's been through. And that was very much my experience in real life with this young woman, was that she was, despite everything she was going through, she was still able to crack jokes in that moment, which was just so like, I don't know, just a really profound experience and profound thing to witness. Uh, yeah, what was the audience response? It's been pretty incredible. I mean, it premiered actually almost 3 years ago in Berlin, and we weren't really sure how an international audience would respond to this film about two women, Indigenous women in Vancouver. But we realized that in the specificity of this specific story, there's a universal sort of understanding. And so what we've found with every public screening that we've had or attended, there's almost always somebody in the audience who comes to us and shares that they've either experienced something similar to Rosie or Isla or both. And that's been quite profound. I mean, it's heartbreaking to know that the story is so universal, but also profound knowing that people are connecting with it in this way and in a way that isn't harmful to them. And I think that's something we always have to consider as filmmakers, is that, you know, the stories we tell have weight, and they do have the power to do harm. And, you know, no matter how great our intentions are, we always have the possibility of doing harm to our audience if we're not considering these things at every step of the way. And so I guess that was kind of just an affirmation of that fact, that there were so many things we could have done wrong, and ultimately that could have led to doing harm to the viewers who understood that story in a very intimate way through lived experience.
And Kimberly.
Janet, you muted yourself, Janet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, Kimberly, I think I would like to ask you, how would you make the case to other writers, directors, producers who are thinking about wanting to make their work, you know, fit these guidelines of being trauma informed, or use this reflective process to come up with something to share with the world that they will be able to have success and that it's worth doing? How do you make the case when you're working with emerging filmmakers?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, it's really also looking at what is it that our goal is with these stories, right? And so, like in Maya's case, oftentimes, you know, the youth that we work with are hoping to make films that help promote healing, or help to kind of reflect their stories with that sense of like hope for liberation, and that sort of aspiration for some sort of transformative healing. And so I think, like, you know, when we're looking at the goals of our work, if we're looking to tell stories that are true to us, at the end of the day, like, we have to really acknowledge the impact that these systems of oppression have on our narratives, and the ways that we sometimes also like reflect our own experience. So, like, you know, I think it's really crucial to kind of think about like how Maya was saying, who is it that's going to watch these films, and what's the impact that we want to have. So many times working with young folks, they might want to tell stories about their experience sort of navigating mental health. And so that I think is it's so important, because it's something that we often don't talk about. It's something that it's another subject matter that's oftentimes stigmatized, and, you know, we become silent systematically because of it. So when we have coached some of and provided mentorship to youth, oftentimes, like, in one case, one of our students wanted to reenact an anxiety attack. And so it was a really powerful film, and we engaged with her and basically asked, you know, what is it that what's your outcome? What's the outcome of, you know, what you want your audience to experience? And who is your audience, right? And so for her, she wanted other foster youth to see this film and to kind of like engage with it. And so, and kind of like tracking down, okay, so what's the message that you want to share with them, right? So she was like, you know, I'm able to overcome this. I'm able to overcome this by utilizing like dance and breathing techniques. And so we were able to kind of help her find like a filmic language where she could both recreate the anxiety attack, but also provide those tools and reenact those tools of support and healing. So I think that was really important because, you know, we wanted to make sure that even if we're taking our audience on a ride of what does it mean to experience this kind of anxiety, we also want to make sure that they're able to ground in the process of watching the film, right? And they're able to kind of collect themselves and not sort of be triggered in a way where they don't have sort of tools within the film itself. And so then upon reflection, the student decided that she wanted to include a trigger warning in the beginning of the film that basically was to say, like, if you feel uncomfortable watching this film, feel free to take a breather and to, like, you know, step outside and recollect. So these are some of the questions that we've been able to encourage our participants to engage in. And I think, you know, ultimately, like, we're all using story as a way to heal ourselves from our own experiences, right? And so how can we do that when we're so bombarded with stories that are conflict-based? And that's what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing conflict as the driving motor for narrative. So I think it's a lot of, like, kind of reprocessing our own experiences through a different lens, and through a lens that is really centering healing and liberation, so that we can redefine narrative and how we understand story.
Before we leave the film, because I want you to talk about the current documentary that you're working on and how you're using some of these practices in that work as well. I wanted to ask you about the title, which is such a beautiful title, and the music, and how the use of music and the poem as a title, how that fits in with your process that you've talked about just now.
You. So we borrowed a title from an essay by Billy Ray Belcourt, who's a brilliant young queer Cree author and scholar, and he's just basically, I don't know, he's a genius. But you know, we really struggled to find a title that encapsulated everything we wanted to say in this film, and then we came across that essay. And felt that everything he speaks about in the essay, but also the title itself was everything. I mean, Rosie and Isla come from very different lived experiences, and that being said, as Indigenous people on this continent, we've all inherited the same history. That history looks different with each nation, but we've all inherited that same history. And you know, someone like Rosie, for me, I have family members like Rosie, and I may, you know, have benefit from certain forms of privilege in that, you know, I'm financially stable. I didn't go through foster care, but I did experience the impacts of intergenerational trauma, and I'm living with you know, trauma in other forms that isn't necessarily so obvious, and so it was important for us to keep that in mind, that these two women share this history. They share this history of trauma, but they also share this history of strength, and that as Indigenous women, especially with the ways that our bodies have been subjugated to such violence and oppression, and systematically so, it was important for us to have that in the title. You know, the body remembers when the world broke open. The body remembers that moment when everything changed for all of us. So that's where the title came from, and we're so lucky that Billy Ray let us use his beautiful words. And then in terms of music, we were able to acquire the rights to two songs that we used in the film. One was Joni Mitchell's Little Green, which is from her Blue album. And Kathleen and I were just writing one day at my house, and I was playing this Joni Mitchell album, and that song came on. And I said to Kathleen, do you know the story behind this song? And she didn't. So I told her, you know, this is about Joni Mitchell having to give her daughter up for adoption. I think she was like 19 or 20. It was before she was a famous musician, and it's a really beautiful song and also so heartbreaking. And Joni Mitchell has Sami ancestry, so she was also born in really close to where I'm from, and so we managed to license that film, and we thought it was just a really maybe too on the nose but beautiful and profound song to use. And then the second song was "Mommy's Little Guy" by Fawn Wood, who's a really talented singer. She does a lot of hand drum music. And what was so important for us throughout the writing process and through the rehearsal process was to keep in mind that this wasn't just a story about these two women. It was a story about these two women and the baby that Rosie was carrying. And I think when we're talking about Indigenous women's bodies, it's really important to think about the ways that our families and communities have been so deeply fractured by colonization, and the ways that systemically women's bodies have been targeted and families have been targeted. And so for generations, Indigenous children were removed and put into residential schools or boarding schools on the American side of the border, and then placed into the child welfare system. And so for Rosie, her driving force is that baby that she's carrying inside of her, and she has, like you said, Janet, she's imagined a future for this child, one that includes her, and she wants to break that cycle of damage that the foster care system has had on her and generations before. And so, when we talk about teen pregnancy in films, it's often through this like frame of reproductive rights. And I think for Indigenous women, keeping in mind everything that's happened to our communities and our families, the right to motherhood is something that's so profound and often overlooked. And so this was about Rosie's right to be a mother, and her right to resist this, damaging, imposing system, on that right to be a mother. And so Mommy's Little Guy was just this like really beautiful lullaby that we thought could help us in the rehearsal process. We used it with Violet all the time to kind of ground her in her body and connect her with this idea of carrying life inside of her, and what that love between her and this life force meant. And then also, just to speak to this greater idea of love between her and the baby, and what Indigenous motherhood means and what it can look like, and also what does it mean to be an Indigenous woman who isn't really sure about motherhood, if that's something she wants, in Isla's character and her experience.
Thank you so much for that. And so I just wanted to remind everybody, we were talking about the film The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. And that's the narrative film. And I can't recommend it enough. I think that folks should watch it. Definitely, I'm still thinking about it. And that's always a sign, right? If you're still able to continue thinking about the film, it has had an impact. And it has had a really good impact on me. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And then I wanted to transition to give you an opportunity to talk about the process for the documentary. So to transition us, I want to ask Kimberly, in this process of creating these guidelines and principles around trauma-informed filmmaking, are there shifts or certain things that you have to keep in mind when it's the documentary as opposed to a narrative film?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I just wanted to say the trailer, even though, I've seen it a couple times and I've watched the film, it's still like just it brought me to the verge of tears again watching it today. And so it's so beautifully done. So I just wanted to name that. And I am super curious, and I know that we're going to talk about documentary, but I'm curious about your shoot days for the feature, for the fiction film. So if you could talk about that. But definitely, I think with documentary, you know, something really, really important is really establishing that rapport and that relationship of respect and trust and mutual collaboration with the non-actors who are on screen. And so I think that it's definitely a process, and that's why many films, many documentaries take many years in production. Maya's film is currently 4 years in the making. And so I think that's, you know, definitely a testament to the investment and that relationship that she's been able to develop, not only herself with the folks that are sharing their stories on screen, but also the crew, to be able to establish that kind of relationship is really, really important. And I think one thing that I've learned as a documentarian is the importance of, yeah, building that rapport amongst all of the crew, and in addition to the director and producer, with those folks on who are on screen, and you know, constantly again re-engaging with these questions of access and how we can really foster that sort of safety. And also, I think, you know, when we are telling people's stories, we have to be really mindful of if it's time for them to share their story, and can we provide them with resources to ensure that they have that kind of support, either through therapy or through some sort of counsel. Because, you know, oftentimes, and we've had questions about this in another panel of even, you know, following stories of folks who might be refugees or whose status is not stable, you know, in the country where they're seeking refuge. If they do at one point or another decide that they can't move forward with production because of anonymity issues or safety, then I think that we as filmmakers have to take it upon ourselves to take, you know, that responsibility of essentially pulling the plug on production in order to really, you know, prioritize the safety of our non-actors who are sharing their stories so generously. So I would say, you know, we always have to prioritize the safety of those who are kind of entering, you know, letting us into their story.
Thank you. So yes, so if you can let us know about the shooting days for the feature that Kimberly asked, and then if you could start sharing whatever you would like to share with us about your process with the documentary and how you have taken these ideas into that work as well. I'd love to hear.
Sure, thanks. So the film, the body remembers when the world broke open was shot in a continuous take. We were inspired by the process of theater, by, you know, the long rehearsal process that exists, and then also the like kinetic energy that builds from a continuous performance. And, you know, film is so often shot chronologically out of order, and we didn't want to put Violet through that experience as well, of like having to give this really intense performance, shot all over the place chronologically. We wanted to support her in telling the story in a way that would, I guess, bring out a really natural or organic performance. And so we decided to shoot the film in a continuous take on 16 millimeters. So 16 millimeter film mags last up to 11 minutes. So that means that we had to build in 12 camera transitions throughout the process. So we rehearsed extensively with Violet, and then also brought in our DP and set up our rehearsal space as though it was like all these different spaces we'd be shooting in, and then carefully shot listed everything. And then when we got into the actual locations, we had 5 days of full crew rehearsal to navigate all of the like choreography that had to happen with all of the camera transitions that were built in, where a camera assistant would swap in a new camera that was already rolling for our DP normally to take on. And so we all had to like carefully choreograph every single moment. And so that was pretty wild, like doing 5 days of full crew rehearsal and having everything choreographed like a play, basically, but a play that goes between like 5 or 6, 7 different locations, and we go through traffic on a real day, and we had to hire like stunt drivers to be our actual drivers. And yeah, so the actual shoot days were actually very short. We did it once a day for 5 days, and then there were 2 days of kind of like the prologue type scenes before Rosie and Isla meet. So those were just shot on their own separate days, but shot in the same format of continuous take. And then, yeah, then the moment that the 2 women meet to the very end of the film is one continuous take. And so we did that once a day for 5 days. And yeah, they were the shortest shoot days I've ever had. We were done in a matter of, just a few hours. Basically, there's the setup and obviously the takedown and all of that, but it was much shorter for our entire crew. So as intense as all the planning and prep and kind of weird stuff that we did was, the actual shoot days were quite low stress, because it was like once the camera started rolling, we had to just go with it, and there was always the possibility for failure, but that was kind of half the fun.
That's wonderful. You're getting a lot of interest in this film from the comments. People are really excited to hear about the process too. And thank you for being so generous in sharing what the process was like. And then I would love to give you an opportunity to talk about the process for your documentary, what you would like to share.
Sure. So the documentary is, it's a portrait of my community, the 𝘞𝘰𝘳𝘮𝘰 First Nation. It's the largest reserve in Canada. Our community was hit by fentanyl, or the opioid crisis, actually 6.5 years ago now. And my mother is a physician on the reserve, and the film is about my community's response to the opioid crisis, how our community came to be leaders in Canada in terms of radical and alternative approaches to the opioid crisis and addiction as a whole. It's no secret that Indigenous communities are very impacted by addiction. It's like, a symptom of everything we've been through and continue to experience. And so the film follows a number of individuals' journeys, people who are in recovery, people who are living with active addictions, and also frontline workers. And we get to see what happens in the community over, I guess we filmed over 3.5 years, and I've been working on the film for close to 5 years. We're almost at picture lock now, actually, but yeah, it's a portrait of so many different people in my community. Literally hundreds of people contributed in some capacity, either in front of or behind the camera, and it's been a really incredible journey in terms of navigating ethics as a storyteller and telling your own communities and your own community and your own family's stories, regardless of our intentions. I think it's always important to recognize that we, as the filmmaker, are always in the position of power, and documentary is always, subjective and biased from the point of view of the filmmaker. And so the film explores also the concept of harm reduction with addictions, and what harm reduction can look like through an Indigenous lens, how an Indigenous community can implement harm reduction. And so I thought about that in the process of making the film, like what does it mean to implement the theory or the idea of harm reduction to the actual practice of filmmaking? How can I ensure that I'm consistently taking care of my audience? And it's something I'm still navigating through the edit process. We're, like I said, we're almost finished, and there's so much that needs to be considered in terms of who's going to be watching this film and how this film can be utilized, and how I can ensure that as the filmmaker, I'm doing as little harm as possible and making a film that's useful for the people who need it most.
So interesting to see how you're how that's going to look when we see the film, how you implemented harm reduction through filmmaking. It's an important conversation. Um, I wanted to make sure that we open up to questions from the audience. But before we do that, I just wanted to give Kimberly an opportunity to tell us, for those people who are creatives that want to think about how to make trauma-informed storytelling and want consulting or assistance, what does Justice for My Sister have to offer?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Janet. We are launching our Black, Indigenous, People of Color Sci-Fi Screenwriting Lab in the spring. So we'll be having calls for applications sometime between February and March. And we invite everybody, if you're interested in sci-fi, if you're interested in, I believe this year we'll be having, the students will be writing short films. So if you're interested in something on those lines, like please reach out. And we're also fundraising for that program. So if people are interested in supporting the work, you can find out more at justiceformysister.org. And we'll be having more trainings about trauma-informed storytelling more specifically, sort of like, you know, a one-off day in February, on February 6th. And we'll be having other panel discussions, partnering with other organizations as well. And so we're just so grateful to Free the Work for partnering with us on this conversation and for connecting us to Elle-Máijá. We just so admire your work, Maya, and thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and all of your process, and you know, really how you're embodying these concepts in a really thoughtful, meaningful way.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. We aspire. So wonderful.
We do have a question already in the chat, and I don't know if we're able to have folks come off mic or come on mic to be able to ask their question. But Jorge Camarote said, I would like to ask about the decision to not to go in depth into Alia's story. I thought it was a very interesting choice, and I wanted to see if there's any comments to Jorge's question.
Yeah, I you know, this film is about a very short encounter between two women. It takes place over like 110 minutes. And so there's a lot that you can't explain about a person or a character in that short period of time. And so it's about these two women coming together and learning what we learn in that period of time about them. And so I think there are moments where we have the opportunity to learn more about Isla. But again, in this situation, you know, she's not the one who's fled the abusive partner, and it was important for us to always consistently hold space for the character of Rosie. And Isla's an important character, but she's also, you know, I think relatable for a lot of like middle class. It's kind of an interesting concept to think about her as this person who benefits from light skin privilege, and the fact that her as a character, she can kind of serve as like an entry point, I think, for like a broader settler audience. It's easier for them to identify with someone who, you know, has the familiar sort of lived experiences. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it was a decision to not go in depth with Isla's character. It was more just we offered the audience what we could in that short period of time, and under those given circumstances.
I also was struck by the fact that you said something that reminded me that it's true in a lot of films, we are expected to know everything about a character, or to know everything that has affected them or impacted them. Again, this kind of idea of, extractive storytelling. And it's refreshing that we only know just what we have seen about Rosie and about Isla, and that's it. And that's enough. It's like, that's what it's almost, when somebody tells you a story, they tell you, that's they gave you a choice. They made a choice to tell you this much, and that's it. And it's back to consent, and it's back to a lot of intentionality. So I would really appreciated that too. If
Yeah,
other
and I want to
questions?
just
Oh, go.
I want to also share an observation that with Maya, Maya, like I feel that in many ways, Ayla and Rosie did share screen time, and we got glimpses into these very intimate moments with both of them. So I would say that like there wasn't this sense of like divulging Rosie's story, or that we got to know her more than Ayla per se. And kind of going back to what you were saying about that shared screen time, the switching off of power, who has the power in each scene. I feel like for me, that really came across. And I noticed somebody had a really good question in the chat. I don't know if it's possible. Well, we're still figuring out if we can bring people on screen to actually ask these questions, but I might just kind of summarize it, and then we can discuss. Oh, did we get them on? Oh, we did. Oh, great.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. You're welcome to turn on your camera if you can.
I have no idea how to do that.
No problem. We'll share your question with us. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. So I'm 22, and I'm really trying to like establish myself as a screenwriter, but it's difficult because I'm trying to figure out how to navigate like breaking into, it just feels like there's this established system, and I don't really want to like conform to some of these like harmful narratives and just like Hollywood norms. So I'm curious, like, how should I go about like finding the right people who won't ask for that conforming and will just like allow me to tell these stories and bring them to life in the way that I want to, as opposed to like the toxic Hollywood ideals?
Are you more interested in television or in film?
Film.
Okay. Well, that's a good start, I would say. In terms, I feel like just generally there's a lot of formulaic sort of expectations around writing for television. So that's why I ask. But I think that there's still a lot of room for creative, like telling stories in creative ways, in ways that are not following the conflict-based model. And we have so many examples from Transparent, right, to, I mean, there are many TV shows that are kind of breaking that mold. But I think that as a aspiring screenwriter, you know, the advice that we always give our participants is like, look to the people who are your peers, right? Like, how can you create your crew of collaborators, of people who have a shared vision with you? And how can you pool your resources to create something that can then go on to like tour a festival circuit, right? And I think a lot of times as independent filmmakers, navigating the festival circuit has been how we've been able to kind of create our own careers, right? And that sort of recognition so that we can go on to get more projects greenlit down the line. But Maya, I'm sure you have much more insight.
I don't know about that, but I think it's so important to build community and then draw from that community and find strength in community. For me, it's been about finding creative producers who support and protect my vision. You know, I've made things that I you know, I don't think are great films because I was learning, right? It's all a learning experience. And I think often when we first start, we all make films that sort of replicate norms that we've seen over and over on screen. But it can be so liberating to know that there isn't one way to do these things. And I think we learned that with The Body Remembers, is that you can do it however you need to do it. Each story can be told in a way that that best supports that story. So process can always be different. But I think it's like when we're talking about funding and accessing financing support and those kinds of things, which is totally, you know, you can't get around that if you're working in the film industry. It is an industry, and you need the funds to make your work, you know. And so when it comes to that kind of thing, it's, I think, really important to approach funders who, you know, support work like yours or work that you admire. Make sure you're on the same page ethically to begin with. Like, don't get involved with people that might be a little bit shady already from the get-go. Make sure to protect yourself and your vision, and to know that, you know, this industry can be a dangerous one, you know, if you're not protecting yourself and making sure that you're building a community of safety and support. But it's, again, when we're talking about like financing and funders, I think it's really important to build on the fact that there are so many films that are being made for audiences that, you know, aren't conforming to the straight, white, cis audience that films have been catered to for so long. And I think, you know, we were so lucky to be picked up by Ava DuVernay's company Array for distribution. And if you look at the work that Array is doing, it's incredible. If you look at the films that they're distributing, they're like no other films that you're going to see on Netflix. But what Array is proving, and what so many other, you know, independent filmmakers who come from marginalized voices are proving, is that there's an audience for these films. So it's really important, I think, to speak to funders in a language that they understand, which is that there is an audience for films like The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, or there's always an opportunity to expand the type of stories we're telling, to expand on process, and to make sure that we are creating work for I don't like to use the word diverse, but for diverse audiences. And so, yeah, it's a tough kind of world to navigate in terms of the film industry, and it's, I guess, a skill that's necessary in order to sustain your career, is to like learn the language of what funders and financiers need, what they need to hear, but also to protect yourself from the get-go, and protect your vision.
Sweet.
And I
Thank you,
think,
guys.
yeah, I want to just also, you know, name that, like, one of the great ways to find who these producers are that are making great films is by both going to film festivals, and now a lot of festivals have moved online, but also, you know, and because there you can kind of interface with different producers and people who are behind really great work, but also just like getting familiar with what is it that's being produced that resonates with you. And, you know, that is going to help you as an artist just evolve your own craft and really understand, like, why is it that I resonate with this film, and what are the elements, you know, how are the beats working, how are the characters being laid out, like at what point do I get to know their backstory, you know, just kind of understanding that the reasons why you resonate with the films, but then also looking to who is actually funding those films, how are they getting those films off the ground, and kind of, you know, trying to do that research that way as well, I think can be helpful just in terms of understanding the landscape a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That has been very empowering. Thank you so much.
I think that we are closing, or if there are more questions, we could take those. But I think that this conversation has been really powerful, and I definitely, well, you know, I came to Justice for My Sister through my friendship with Kimberly, when during the time when she was making her documentary. And I was, like she said, a mentor in the Black, Indigenous, People of Color's screenwriting lab. And that was one of my favorite parts of the lab, is the conversation that we started at the beginning when the emerging filmmakers that were taking part in that lab started to think about what it would mean to make science fiction that was coming from with a trauma-informed lens. And that conversation was powerful, just different perspectives, people talking together. And I think that that's it, that is what it takes for us to be able to create the type of work that we want to see, is to have these kind of conversations, to inspire each other with each other's processes, each other's thinking, each other's questions. That's why I'm so grateful to Elle-Máijá, Tailfeathers, for your generosity in really being transparent with your process, because I think that's also something that we have to break if we want to be able to achieve the things that we want to create in this industry. We have to break the habit of people being very just not wanting to share process, or not wanting to be transparent about how things were actually done, and leaving people kind of unsure about how to get started. So I feel like this conversation will be something that needs to be continued, so that we can continue to create this type of work. So it can be a body of work that's out there, and it becomes a norm, instead of, oh, this is just one or a few films that are created in this way. So this has been a very inspiring conversation. I wanted to leave last words for first Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers, and then Kimberly, and to thank Justice for My Sister and Free the Work and Julissa and the wonderful folks this evening.
Sorry, stepping in real quick before we move on. Aiden Korokin actually does have a question. Do we have time to answer him? And then we also have Carolina Valencia also, who has a question.
Aiden, yes, please go ahead with
Oh,
your
sorry.
question.
I was waiting for you to give me the go ahead. But Elle-Máijá, thank you first of all for giving us your time. It's been very informative, and I unfortunately have not seen the film yet, but I'm going to go look up where to watch it after this. And I guess I was just wondering, what was your process when you were writing your characters? I know that this was based off of your like real life experience. So how did you kind of develop that into both believable characters that you don't have to necessarily give the full background on, but you know, what did you do to decide to make the decisions about what to include and what not to include in the screenwriting process, so that the audience would believe that these were real people, but you know, we're getting a snippet of their lives.
Thanks, Aiden. Yeah, we built full, you know, life history backstories for both of these characters, that for ourselves as the screenwriters we were aware of. It was really important for us to create, you know, these multi-dimensional characters who had histories and lived experiences. And I think in terms of like communicating who they were to the audience, it was about placing them in this sort of remarkable experience of encountering each other under such a heightened situation. And so, yeah, what we said about the characters, I think, was said through the actions that they took, and also the world that was built around them. So we had really, really talented, thoughtful people in our art department who built the set for Rosie's home and also for Isla's home, and we had a lot of conversations about like what those places look like, what those spaces look like, how to make them look lived in, and how to also show that, you know, Rosie comes from this challenging situation, but she still lives in a home where there is love. It's just so much more complicated than this like black and white, good or bad sort of situation. So yeah, there's a lot to consider, and I think not everything has to be on the page, and it doesn't all have to be said through the characters. It's what you know as a writer, what the world that you build about this person and their lived experiences, everything that exists before that first moment you see them on screen, or the first moment you read them on the page.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And can we bring on Carolina?
So actually, Carolina has requested that her question be read, so I will read out her question. She asks, thank you very much for this panel and all for the wonderful things that you've shared. My question is, do you have any advice in treating this kind of topics regarding children narratives for children?
Oh, wow. That's really tough. I guess, well, first of all, the film premiered in the Berlinale section that's specifically for young people. And so we hadn't even really thought about this film as being one that might be for young people, but had completely overlooked the fact that Rosie is, she's still a teenager, she's still a young person. And so that was a really interesting thing to navigate, was how to engage with young people. And, you know, I think young people in this day and age especially have been exposed to so much more, regardless of their lived experience, just kind of like the era we live in with the internet and the way that our world moves so quickly. I think young people are pretty aware. And so when it came to thinking about youth or teenagers watching this film, it was about that, about considering like, that they're, you know, young people are very smart, young people are very capable and resourceful, and to give them that credit when thinking about creating these characters, but then also thinking about the types of conversations that we might have with them. But in terms of creating work for even a younger audience, like I don't know, that's beyond my my experience, because it's a very specific audience, and I think when telling really challenging stories like that, I don't know, it's tough. I don't have a very good answer to that.
Yeah, I think it's a process of like constantly, again, centering like the safety of your audience, but also of anybody that either is performing in your film or is sharing their story if it's a documentary, or even if you do bring on children consultants. You know, I mean, one of the things that it's really important for Justice for My Sister is, you know, any consultant that you bring on should be compensated, right? Especially if they're giving you some sort of insight to another perspective that will shape the actual outcome and the trajectory of your narrative. So I think that's really important to consider. But, you know, also recognizing that just kind of, I think, always looking towards like, what is it that you want? What's the outcome of this story? What if, you know, the outcome of the story is, what's your takeaway? What is your call to action, right? What is it that you want your audience to walk away with? And so I think reflecting on that, and thinking it through also with folks that are versed in young children education is really important. So I would recommend that, you know, teaming up with either a therapist that works with young children or an educator who is specialized in early child education. That would be my recommendation for the time being. And we can continue to converse, because I think that like Janet mentioned, you know, these are really important conversations that we have to constantly engage with, just considering the power dynamics of filmmaking as artists, right? We do have this sort of power in shaping narratives. And so how can we be responsible to our communities in that process? And so Justice for My Sister will be continuing to hold these sort of pláticas and panels. So just so grateful so much. Thank you so much, Maya, for being here and for sharing your knowledge so generously with us. I learned so much. And thank you so much, Janet, for facilitating. And just we're so grateful for you helping us to open up this space and to really hold space for us all. Thank you, Julissa, for being our moderator. We appreciate, or our technician, we appreciate you. And I also want to acknowledge all the labor and love that Justice for My Sister Collective has put into creating these guidelines. And
sorry, I don't know if these are your closing thoughts. We do have one more anonymous question here. Would you like me to read that out loud, or?
Oh, okay. I didn't see it.
Yeah, no worries. Do you want we can read it out loud, or?
So I want to just encourage the person who asked the question. You know, we really think that The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open is a great example of how to honor and really acknowledge the impact of trauma without depicting the violence. So I think that that's a really good example. Another really good example is Full Beat by 𝘞𝘰𝘬𝘦, which you can see on HBO. It's a short film. And we'll be posting more information in the days to come on our social media so that we can provide you with more resources and references. So please follow along. And yeah, I also want to say thank you to Free the Work for helping to coordinate this event. We would just really appreciate everybody on the team there. Tara and Chloe and Charissa as well.
I wanted to. No, I just wanted to give Maya also an opportunity to give just like a closing word as well.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really wonderful, and it's a really profound sort of feeling to know that these conversations are happening, and that there's so many people who care to think about trauma-informed storytelling. It gives me a lot of hope, and I feel like the film industry is headed in a really interesting direction, just in terms of changing the narratives that are privileged, and resisting extractive or oppressive forms of storytelling. And yeah, I really am honored to have been a guest, and I really appreciated the presentation and all of the questions. And so yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. And Kimberly, your last words.
I just want to encourage all the attendees to make something. You know, I just want to encourage you, if it's your own story, if it's something about your family, if it's I want these conversations to encourage you to engage with your work and to really, be able to center your art practice. So thank you for showing up, and thank you for showing up for yourselves and for your practice today. Janet, I think that you're frozen. Oh, you're back. Okay, great.
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you. It was an honor to be part of this conversation. And I wanted to say, part of being trauma informed is also just acknowledging that so many of us have been impacted by trauma and intergenerational trauma because of colonization, because of people being enslaved, because of exploitation of immigrants. I mean, there's just so many things that we have all gone through, that this earth has gone through, that our waters have gone through. And so it's amazing to be able to just recognize that and have that intention as we create work, and I think it's so powerful to be able to remember the whole reason why we tell stories is to create healing spaces. So this has been a great reminder, and I'm so grateful for this conversation, and I hope that everyone, just like the way we began with breathing together, that we end with breathing together, and that we move on with light. So everybody take a deep breath in and release, and move forward in light. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.